The night that changed everything. The winter storm had swallowed Elmwood whole. The howling wind ripped through the streets, rattling old shop signs and sending flurries of snow swirling in every direction. The streetlights flickered, barely holding back the darkness. Most of the town had gone to bed hours ago, their homes locked tight against the bitter cold. Sheriff Daniel Hayes maneuvered his patrol car slowly down Main Street, his tires crunching through the freshly fallen snow. His breath fogged up the windshield, forcing him to rub it clear with his gloved hand. The heater sputtered, barely making a dent against the icy air that seeped through the old cruiser's doors. He exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. Nights like this made the silence feel heavier, like a ghost town trapped beneath a frozen sky. He had seen enough bitter winters to know that the cold had a way of creeping into the bones, not just of the body, but of the soul. As he passed Miller's convenience store, something made him slow down. The store had been closed for hours, yet the back door was ajar, a thin sliver of light cutting through the darkness. His instincts kicked in immediately. "Strange," he muttered, pulling the car to a stop. Reaching for his radio, he hesitated. It could be nothing. A store clerk who forgot to lock up. Or maybe just the wind. But something in his gut told him otherwise. Sliding out of the car, Daniel pulled his coat tighter against the biting wind. Snow crunched under his boots as he approached the door, his hand resting on his holster. The town didn't see much crime, but in his line of work, he had learned never to assume. He stepped inside cautiously, his flashlight sweeping over the darkened aisles. The shelves stood silent, their products lined neatly under the dim emergency lights. Everything seemed undisturbed, except a sound. A faint rustling near the back of the store. His pulse quickened as he stepped forward, his boots whispering against the linoleum floor. He swung his flashlight toward the noise. Two small figures huddled near a shelf, their tiny hands clutching stolen food. For a moment, Daniel just stared. He had been prepared for trouble, maybe a junkie looking for quick cash, or a desperate drifter breaking in to escape the cold. But this? The children couldn't have been older than 6. A boy and a girl. Their clothes were too thin for the brutal weather, threadbare and covered in patches of grime. Their cheeks were red from the cold, their hands trembling as they clutched their stolen loot, packets of crackers, a loaf of bread, and a few small bottles of water. The girl, the smaller of the two, gasped when she saw him. The boy instinctively stepped in front of her, shielding her from view. Daniel lowered his flashlight so it wouldn't blind them. "It's okay," he said gently. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The boy's eyes darted toward the door, his muscles tensing like he was ready to run. Daniel raised a hand in reassurance. Hey, he said softly. "You don't have to run. I just want to talk." The girl sniffled. "We didn't mean to steal," she whispered. "We were just so hungry." Daniel's heart clenched. He had seen hunger before, but never like this. The desperation in their eyes, the way their tiny fingers gripped the food like it was their only lifeline, it told him everything he needed to know. "How long have you two been out here?" he asked. The boy hesitated, then finally spoke. "A long time." Daniel's gaze softened. "Where are your parents?" The girl clutched the boy's sleeve, her chin quivering. "We don't got none." Silence stretched between them, the weight of those words settling in Daniel's chest. He glanced at the food in their hands, then back at their frail, shivering bodies. They shouldn't have been out in this cold. They shouldn't have been alone at all. He exhaled slowly, pushing down the emotions rising in his chest. "Okay," he said finally. "Here's what we're gonna do." The children flinched, expecting punishment. But instead, Daniel took off his coat and draped it over the girl's small shoulders. "Let's get you somewhere warm first, yeah?" The boy narrowed his eyes. "You're not gonna take us to some shelter, are you?" Daniel studied him. There was fear in his voice, but not the kind of fear a child should have. Not the kind that came from getting in trouble for stealing. No, this was deeper. Worn. As if the boy had learned, at far too young an age, that some places were worse than the streets. Daniel's jaw tightened. He had seen what happened to kids shuffled through the system. He had seen the bruises they carried, the vacant stares of those who had already learned not to trust anyone. No child should have to learn that lesson. "I won't let anything happen to you," he promised. The boy studied him, uncertain. But slowly, hesitantly, he nodded. And just like that, Daniel Hayes made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. A promise in the cold. The wind screamed through the streets as Daniel led the two children outside, his heavy coat draped around the little girl's trembling shoulders. His patrol car sat idling at the curb, the heater barely keeping up against the brutal winter chill. The boy hesitated at the door, his fingers tightening around his sister's. "Where are you taking us?" His voice held a wary edge, one that didn't belong to a child his age. Daniel turned, lowering himself slightly to meet the boy's gaze. "Somewhere warm. Somewhere safe." The boy's lips pressed together. "We don't do shelters." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Why not?" The girl, still silent, clutched her brother's sleeve. He shook his head. "They're worse." A pang of something sharp struck Daniel's chest. Worse than freezing on the streets? Worse than stealing to survive? He had worked with enough social workers to know that not every foster home was a safe haven. Some were cruel. Some were worse than the life these kids were running from. Daniel inhaled, his breath visible in the icy air. "I promise I won't let anyone hurt you." The boy stared at him for a long time before finally nodding. "Okay." Daniel opened the back door of the cruiser. "Hop in." The boy guided his sister inside first, then followed. Daniel shut the door gently, making sure not to startle them. He climbed into the driver's seat and cranked the heat as high as it would go. The car rumbled forward, leaving the store behind. The radio crackled with static, but Daniel ignored it, his thoughts already racing. "All right," he said, glancing at them in the rearview mirror. "You got names?" The boy hesitated. "I'm Eli." He nudged the girl. "She's Ava." Daniel smiled slightly. "Nice to meet you, Eli." "Ava." Ava curled up under his coat, her eyelids drooping as exhaustion set in. Eli, however, stayed alert, watching Daniel carefully. "How old are you two?" A beat of silence. Then, 6. Twins. Daniel felt another sharp pang in his chest. His grip on the steering wheel tightened. He had a son once. A little boy with golden hair and bright eyes who used to sit in his lap and giggle at silly stories. But that was a long time ago. Another lifetime. He forced his thoughts away. "Where have you been staying?" Eli's jaw clenched. "We find places." Daniel exhaled slowly. These kids had learned to survive in a world that didn't care about them. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could change what happened next. "You ever been to a police station before?" he asked. Ava stiffened. Eli's eyes darkened. "We didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Daniel said quickly. "I just want to make sure you get some food. And maybe a warm bed for the night." Eli glanced at Ava, then nodded. Daniel made a silent vow. He wouldn't let these kids fall through the cracks. Not if he could help it. The station. The Elmwood police station was nearly empty at this hour. Officer Melanie Cruz sat behind the front desk, nursing a steaming cup of coffee, her dark curls tied back in a loose ponytail. She raised a brow as Daniel entered with two bundled-up kids in tow. "Well, this is new." Yeah, Daniel muttered. Long story. Melanie set down her coffee. You good? Daniel hesitated. We'll see. He led the kids into the break room, flipping on the lights. The old vending machine hummed in the corner, next to a small table covered in case files and half-empty coffee cups. Daniel grabbed a couple of prepackaged sandwiches from the fridge and set them on the table. Here. Eat. Eli didn't hesitate. He unwrapped the sandwich and tore off a piece for Ava before taking a bite himself. Ava, still half asleep, chewed slowly, her eyelids heavy. Daniel pulled a chair closer. You two got anyone? Family? Eli shook his head. Just us. Daniel leaned back. No aunts, uncles, or distant relatives. That meant social services. Foster care. He watched the way Eli's hand rested protectively on Ava's shoulder, the way his eyes darted toward the door, already calculating an escape route. These kids didn't trust easily. And Daniel couldn't blame them. Ava yawned, her tiny head tipping against Eli's side. His arm wrapped around her instinctively. Daniel rubbed his jaw. He knew the law. Knew what had to happen next. But something in his gut twisted at the thought of sending them into a system that had already failed them. Melanie appeared in the doorway. What's the plan, Sheriff? Daniel sighed. We call child services in the morning. Melanie studied him. And tonight? He exhaled. They stay here. Melanie raised a brow but didn't argue. I'll grab some blankets. Daniel watched as Eli carefully finished his sandwich, making sure Ava had enough first. Something deep inside him stirred. He had lost a child once. Maybe this was his second chance. He just didn't know how hard the fight would be. A bond worth fighting for. The wind howled against the station's windows as the storm continued to rage outside. Inside, the small police station was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of paperwork and the distant hum of the coffee machine. Daniel sat at his desk, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. He leaned back in his chair, watching Eli and Ava from a distance. They were curled up together on the worn-out station couch, wrapped in blankets that Melanie had brought from the supply closet. Eli stayed awake, his wary eyes flicking around the room as if expecting someone to snatch them away at any moment. Ava, on the other hand, had finally given in to exhaustion, her tiny frame burrowed beneath the oversized blanket. Daniel ran a hand down his face. He had seen plenty of hard cases in his years on the force, but something about these two gnawed at him in a way he couldn't shake. Melanie appeared beside him, arms crossed. They trust you. Daniel glanced up. I don't know about that. Melanie smirked. Eli hasn't taken his eyes off you. He's testing you. Seeing if you're just another cop who's going to push them through the system. Daniel exhaled. That's exactly what I'm supposed to do. Melanie's smirk faded. And is that what you're going to do? Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the kids. Eli, he called softly. The boy's head snapped up, his hand tightening around the edge of the blanket. You should get some sleep. Eli hesitated, then shook his head. Not tired. Daniel knew better. The kid was running on empty, but trust didn't come easy to children like him. He stood up and grabbed an extra chair, placing it near the couch. All right. I'll stay here, then. Eli studied him, searching for some hidden motive, but Daniel just leaned back in the chair, stretching his legs out in front of him. Melanie arched a brow. You planning to sit there all night? Daniel shrugged. Maybe. Ava stirred in her sleep, mumbling something under her breath. Eli quickly placed a hand on her shoulder, soothing her. Daniel felt something twist inside his chest. This wasn't just survival. This was love. And it was the kind of love that kids like Eli and Ava rarely got from the world. Memories of the past. Hours passed. The storm outside had lessened, though the bitter cold still gripped the town. Daniel sat in silence, his gaze drifting to the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. He should have gone home by now. Should have called social services already. But he couldn't shake the memories clawing their way to the surface. It had been years, but he still remembered the way his son had curled up in his arms after a long day, how his laughter used to echo through the house. He remembered the weight of his tiny body as he carried him to bed, pressing a kiss to his forehead. And he remembered the phone call. The sirens. The hospital. The moment everything changed. His son had been taken from him in an instant. A drunk driver. A senseless accident. Daniel had drowned himself in work after that, burying the pain under long hours and routine police reports. He had convinced himself that the past was the past. But now, staring at Eli and Ava, alone, abandoned, clinging to each other like they were all they had left in the world, something inside him cracked open again. He wasn't their father. But for some reason, they had asked him to be. And that thought terrified him more than anything. A decision that changed everything. A soft sound broke through the silence. Eli. He had finally dozed off, his small frame curled protectively around Ava. His chest rose and fell in steady, even breaths. Daniel sighed, rubbing his temples. He had no idea what the morning would bring, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't just walk away. His phone buzzed against the desk. He picked it up reluctantly. It was Child Services. Daniel stared at the screen, his stomach twisting. They'd come for the kid soon. And something deep inside him told him he wasn't ready to let them go. Torn between duty and heart. The air inside the police station had settled into an uneasy stillness. The storm outside had finally weakened, but Daniel felt as though he was standing in the center of another kind of storm, one that was brewing inside him. His phone buzzed again. Child Protective Services. The name on the screen sent an unsettling chill through him. He had called them, of course. It was protocol. It was the law. Children in situations like this were placed into the system, where social workers would assess their needs and determine their next steps. But as Daniel looked at Eli and Ava, still curled up together on the couch, he felt his chest tighten. Something about the idea of handing them over to the system made his stomach twist in a way he couldn't ignore. He glanced at Melanie, who was pouring herself another cup of coffee. "They'll be here soon," he said quietly. She exhaled, not looking at him. "I know. You think this is the right thing to do?" Melanie turned toward him then, her expression unreadable. "Do you?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he walked over to the couch, crouching down next to Eli. The boy's breathing was steady, but he stirred slightly, his hand gripping Ava's blanket as if he were afraid someone might take it away. Daniel hesitated. Then, without thinking, he reached out and placed a hand gently on Eli's shoulder. The boy's eyes fluttered open, hazy with sleep but immediately alert. "They're coming to take us, aren't they?" he murmured. Daniel's throat tightened. "I don't know yet." Eli didn't look convinced. He sat up, careful not to disturb Ava, and wrapped his arms around his knees. "I know how this works," he said quietly. "They put us in a house with people who don't really want us there. Then they send us somewhere else. And somewhere else. Until we don't matter anymore." Daniel clenched his jaw. "That's not true." Eli gave him a look that was far too knowing for a child his age. "It is." And Daniel hated that he couldn't argue. The system's cold reality. 20 minutes later, the door to the station swung open, letting in a sharp gust of cold air. Two people stepped inside, a man and a woman, both dressed in heavy coats, their ID badges clipped to their pockets. Daniel stood. "Sheriff Carter," the woman asked, pulling off her gloves. "That's me. I'm Julia Perkins from Child Protective Services. This is my partner, Brian Holt. We spoke on the phone." Daniel nodded stiffly. "Right. Thanks for coming out so late." Julia gave a small smile, but there was something professional, detached, about it. "It's what we do." She glanced over at the couch, where Eli was now sitting upright, his expression guarded. Ava was still asleep, unaware of what was about to happen. Daniel crossed his arms. "Before you take them, I need to know where they're going." Julia blinked, as if she hadn't expected him to ask. "Well, given that we don't have much background on them yet, they'll be placed in a temporary emergency shelter until we can evaluate their case." "A shelter," Daniel repeated flatly. "It's standard procedure," Brian chimed in. "They won't be there long, just until we can assess their needs and find an appropriate foster home." Daniel bit back a curse. He had been in law enforcement long enough to know that temporary could mean weeks, even months. He had seen kids shuffled from shelter to shelter, waiting for a home that never seemed to come. Eli must have sensed his hesitation because he spoke up. "Please," he said softly. "Don't let them take us." Daniel's gut twisted. He was just a cop. He wasn't family. He had no legal right to them. But everything inside him was screaming that letting them go was a mistake. And for the first time in years, he felt something he had long buried under duty and grief, a need to fight for something that mattered. A choice that changed everything. Julia and Brian moved toward the couch. Eli tensed but didn't fight as Julia knelt in front of him. "Hey there," she said gently. "I know this is scary, but we're going to make sure you and your sister are safe, okay?" Eli didn't answer. Julia reached for Ava, but the moment her hand brushed against the blanket, Eli grabbed his sister and pulled her closer. "No." Brian frowned. "Eli, we need to take you somewhere safe." "This is safe," Eli shot back. "We want to stay here." Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. Everything about this situation felt wrong. The law said he had to let them go. But his heart, the part of him he had tried to silence for so long, was telling him otherwise. And for the first time in his career, Daniel Carter made a decision not as a cop, but as a man who couldn't turn his back on these kids. "No," he said firmly. Julia blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel took a step forward, standing protectively between the twins and the CPS agents. "They're not going anywhere." Brian scoffed. "Sheriff Carter, with all due respect, you don't have the authority to make that decision." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted. "But I do have the authority to investigate potential threats to their safety." Julia's expression darkened. "And what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm saying I'm not handing them over until I know for damn sure they're better off." Silence stretched between them. Julia sighed, rubbing her temples. "Sheriff, if you interfere with a CPS placement, you're looking at serious consequences." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm willing to take that risk." He turned to Eli, then to Ava, who had finally woken up, blinking in confusion. "I made a promise," Daniel said softly. "And I keep my promises." For the first time since meeting them, Eli's eyes shone with something other than fear. Hope. And Daniel knew he wasn't backing down. No matter what it cost him, the battle for family. The air inside the station turned tense, thick with the weight of what Daniel had just done. Julia from Child Protective Services stared at him in shock. Brian, her partner, looked ready to argue. "Do you even understand what you're doing, Sheriff Carter?" Brian asked, his tone sharp. "You're interfering with a state case. You could lose your job over this." Daniel knew that. He also knew that if he let Eli and Ava go now, he might never see them again. Worse, he might never know if they were safe. He folded his arms over his chest. Then I guess I'll have to deal with the consequences. Julia sighed, clearly frustrated. Sheriff, you don't have legal guardianship over these kids. Right now, the only thing keeping them here is you. And the longer you delay this, the worse it's going to be, for you and for them. Ava whimpered, pressing herself closer to Eli. She might not have fully understood the conversation, but she could feel the tension. Daniel exhaled, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. He knew what they were saying was technically right. He had no legal claim over Eli and Ava. But he also knew that trusting the system to do right by them was a gamble he wasn't willing to take. A desperate plea. Eli suddenly spoke, his voice raw with desperation. Please, he said, looking up at Daniel. We don't want to go. We know what happens to kids like us. We just want to stay. We'll be good. We promise. Daniel felt his heart break right then and there. He turned back to Julia and Brian, his jaw clenched. Give me 48 hours, he said. Brian frowned. For what? To prove that I'm the best option for them, Daniel said. I don't care what paperwork I have to file or what hoops I have to jump through. Give me 2 days, and if I can't make it work, then I'll step aside. Julia and Brian exchanged glances. This isn't how things are done, Julia warned. But it's what I'm asking for, Daniel countered. And if you don't think I'll fight this in every legal way possible, then you don't know me. Silence stretched between them. Finally, Julia let out a slow breath. Fine. 48 hours. But if you don't have the paperwork started by then, we're coming back with a court order. Daniel nodded. That's all I need. An uphill battle. The moment Julia and Brian left, Daniel felt like the real fight was just beginning. Melanie, his longtime friend and dispatcher, was still standing by the desk, arms crossed. You're crazy, you know that, she said. Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I figured that out about 5 minutes ago. She shook her head. You realize this isn't just about signing a few forms. Becoming a foster parent, let alone adopting, takes time. And I know you. You're not the most patient guy. I don't need patience, Daniel said. I need a lawyer. Melanie let out a soft laugh, shaking her head again. You really are serious about this, aren't you? Daniel glanced over at Eli and Ava. The way they clung to each other, the exhaustion in their tiny faces, the fear in their eyes. He'd spent his whole life enforcing the law. But for the first time in years, he realized that sometimes, the law wasn't enough. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant going beyond the rules. And this was one of those times. The search for a way forward. By the next morning, Daniel was running on about 2 hours of sleep and way too much coffee. He had spent the night researching foster care and emergency guardianship laws. Everything he read only made things seem more complicated. The process could take months, sometimes years. But he didn't have months. So he did the only thing he could think of. He called Rachel Whitmore, one of the best family lawyers in the state. Rachel was an old friend, someone he had worked with years ago when he was still a rookie. She had a reputation for being ruthless in court, and if anyone could help him find a loophole, it was her. She picked up on the second ring. Daniel Carter, she said. I haven't heard from you in years. What kind of trouble are you in? Not me, Daniel said. 2 kids. And I need your help. Rachel sighed. You realize family law isn't something you can just fast-track, right? I don't need a fast track, Daniel said. I need a miracle. There was a pause. Tell me everything, Rachel finally said. A race against time. By the time Daniel arrived at Rachel's office, Eli and Ava were right by his side. Rachel, a sharp-eyed woman with a no-nonsense attitude, glanced at the twins before turning to Daniel. They look exhausted. They are, Daniel said. And if I don't do something soon, they'll end up back in the system. Rachel sighed and motioned for them to sit. All right, let's start with the basics. Any relatives in the picture? Daniel shook his head. Not that we know of. That actually helps, Rachel said. No one to contest guardianship. But the problem is, you're a single man with no prior fostering experience. The state's not going to just hand them over to you. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Then tell me what I have to do. Rachel studied him for a long moment. All right, she said finally. There might be a way. Daniel's heart leaped. I'm listening. Rachel pulled out a folder and flipped through a few papers. There's something called an emergency temporary guardianship clause. It's rare, but in certain cases, if a child's well-being is at risk, a judge can grant temporary guardianship to a responsible adult, even if they haven't been through the foster system. Daniel sat up. How do we make that happen? Rachel leaned forward. We find the judge who's on duty tonight. We get an emergency petition filed. And we prove that you, and only you, are the best option for these kids. A risk worth taking. Daniel felt a surge of hope for the first time in days. But Rachel wasn't done. There's one more thing, she said. If you do this, you're making a statement that you intend to fight for them. CPS won't like that. They'll push back hard. They might even dig into your past, looking for any reason to disqualify you. Daniel nodded. I don't care. Rachel's expression softened. I figured you'd say that. She closed the folder and stood. Let's go find a judge. Eli and Ava looked up at Daniel, uncertainty in their eyes. You mean? Eli started. You're really trying to keep us? Daniel crouched down in front of him. I told you, he said. I don't break my promises. For the first time since they met, Eli let out a shaky breath, and smiled. Daniel knew they still had a fight ahead of them. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid to fight. Because some things were worth it. And family was one of them. Fighting for a future. The courthouse was nearly empty when Daniel, Rachel, and the kids arrived that evening. The halls, usually filled with lawyers and defendants, were eerily quiet, just the distant echo of footsteps from security guards making their rounds. Rachel led them toward Judge William Harper's office. He was the only judge still working at this hour, and if anyone could grant an emergency temporary guardianship, it was him. Rachel glanced at Daniel as they walked. Harper's tough but fair, she said. He won't be easily convinced, but if we present a strong enough case, he might give you a chance. Daniel nodded, gripping Eli's small hand in his. That's all I need. Ava, walking beside them, kept close to Rachel, her little fingers curled into the hem of Rachel's blazer. She had barely spoken since leaving the sheriff's station, but her eyes darted nervously around the unfamiliar courthouse. Daniel could feel the tension in both kids. They were scared. And no matter how much he wanted to promise them that everything would be okay, the truth was, he didn't know if it would be. The judge's decision. Judge Harper was a tall, graying man with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce through anyone standing before him. He sat behind his desk, flipping through the emergency petition Rachel had just handed him. You're asking for something highly unusual, Harper finally said, setting the papers down. Mr. Carter, you're a sheriff, not a licensed foster parent. Why should I grant you guardianship over these children when the state has already placed them in the protective care of child services? Daniel took a deep breath. Because the system is broken, he said. Because I've seen too many kids slip through the cracks, shuffled from home to home, never knowing what real safety feels like. And because I know, deep in my gut, that if I let these kids go now, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Judge Harper studied him, unmoved. That's a very emotional answer, he said. But emotions don't hold up in court. Rachel stepped in, her voice firm. Your Honor, we're not asking for permanent custody today. We're asking for a temporary order so we can file the proper paperwork for long-term guardianship. Sheriff Carter can provide these children with immediate stability, something the foster system cannot guarantee right now. Harper turned his gaze to Eli and Ava. You too, he said, his voice softer. What do you want? Eli straightened, gripping Ava's hand. We want to stay with Sheriff Carter. Ava nodded quickly, eyes wide. We don't want to go back. The judge sighed, rubbing his temple. This is a legal gray area, he admitted. But given the circumstances. He picked up his pen and signed the emergency guardianship order. Daniel exhaled sharply. Rachel smiled. Harper set the paper down. You have 30 days, Carter. That's all I can give you for now. You'll need to start the official adoption process immediately if you want this to be permanent. Daniel nodded. Thank you, Your Honor. Harper leaned forward. Don't thank me yet. The state will fight this. CPS won't like that you went around them. Be ready for a battle. Daniel squared his shoulders. I always am. The fallout. By the time they left the courthouse, Eli and Ava were clinging to Daniel's arms. Their little bodies sagged with exhaustion, but for the first time, they looked like they believed, even if just a little bit, that they had a home. Rachel walked beside Daniel as they made their way to his truck. That was the easy part, she warned. Now comes the real fight. Daniel nodded. I figured. She turned to him. Are you sure you want to do this, Daniel? Adopting 2 kids isn't something you can do halfway. You'd be committing to them for life. He glanced down at the small hands gripping his sleeves. I was never the settling down type, he admitted. But I'd rather spend my life fighting for these 2 than let them get lost in a system that doesn't care. Rachel sighed. Then get ready, Sheriff. Because CPS will be coming for them. Daniel tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he drove them home. Let them come. He wasn't letting go of his kids.